president was clear as the strike started that there was a possibility that you could see U.S. casualties. I don't know that there's an expectation to see them as quickly as we did. The reality is, in the first day, it's easy, that there's a lot of momentum. People are very excited. The longer the war continues and the more casualties that happen on the US side, the harder it is going to be for Trump to maintain the support, even of some of the Republicans in Congress and Republicans across the country, and certainly some independents. The reality is the president didn't prepare the American people for this war in the same way that President Bush prepared the US for Iraq. Now, in the end, it didn't actually matter. It became an albatross around his neck, the Iraq War did for President Bush. For President Trump, there are some differences. No boots on the ground make it a little easier. You're not going to see the same type of images coming out that you did from the Iraq War. But nevertheless, if you start to see the death toll increasing or just the casualty and injury toll increasing among US soldiers, you're going to get a lot of people, especially within the MAGA movement, who fundamentally have not been nearly as supportive of this type of foreign adventurism in the Middle East and thought President Trump had promised during the campaign not to do it. I think there's been some surprise, including by me, about how aggressive Iran has been in attacking what is U.S. personnel and assets in the Gulf states, but still then also civilian infrastructure, civilian entities in those countries. If you add to it pressures from oil and a spike in oil, it makes it much, much more challenging. There's a number of differences between the 12-day war and where we are today, but the two that are, I think, most prominent in driving the situation are one on the Trump side, the US side, and one on the Iranian side. On the US side, during the 12-day war, it wasn't the US in the lead, it was Israel. And there was a lot of debate about whether the US would even get involved. And so when it did, it made a fundamental decision to do so in a very narrow way, with a very clear goal and a very clear strategy. And that was to diminish the Iranian nuclear program and hit at the targets that Israel would not be able to sufficiently do itself. Now we're seeing a decision to have a much more widespread war with an open-ended result at the end. That, yes, maybe you're looking for regime change, as the president had said, but how you get there is much less clear. Iran's number one priority for this regime has always been about its own survival, more so than taking care of its people, more so than its economy, more so than its capabilities across sectors. Survival is number one. And so what that has meant is, in the past, the Iranians didn't feel that they were at risk of survival. Even the targets by the Israelis in June wasn't actually putting the regime at risk. Now it seems like the regime really does feel like its actual survival is in jeopardy. And so because of that, it's taking much more forward-leaning and a much more aggressive stance in terms of how it targets and what it targets. That's meant US deaths, certainly in hope that it will create pressure that the Trump administration will halt this war sooner rather than later. It means targeting Arab states and especially Gulf states in hope that they too will pressure President Trump. Whether or not they end up doing so is yet to be seen. But for the Iranians, it's about creating as much pressure as possible. And so it also wouldn't be a surprise, for instance, to see in the coming days or weeks the Iranians undertake asymmetric attacks, not just cyber attacks that I think is reasonable to assume are already happening, but terrorist attacks, not in the region per se, but perhaps in South Asia, in Latin America, and of course, Europe. Iran's goal right now for its regime survival is to bide as much time as possible, to elongate this out as much as possible, and to cause as much death and destruction as possible in hopes that together that will form the basis for enough pressure to compel the US to end the war. I think whether or not you get more political pressure or more backing from the American people for this conflict is fundamentally going to be about how it plays out. If casualty numbers remain low ultimately, if the 3 soldiers killed in Kuwait are the only 3 soldiers killed, then it's likely President Trump will be able to sustain the conflict for a fairly good amount of time, certainly weeks, if not months. If we start to see very quickly US casualty numbers ticking up, if we start to see the Iranians having greater and greater success and no real indication that the regime is splintering or factions are forming, or that the US and Israel have sufficiently undermined it, in other words, that in the end of the day, it's still going to remain in place, then I think very quickly you're going to see the American people question what we're doing here, and especially Republicans and independents say, this isn't what President Trump promised.